Hi there. We've come to the end of our little ball of twine as we've unrolled the history of the United Church of Canada, and I really hope that you've learned some new things and gained some insights that are helpful to you. I hope you've also learned that, at least from the point of view of the historian, events don't stand on their own. So, whatever happens in a church, be it a denomination or a single congregation, is always impacted by the things that happen around it. It's always impacted by the events and the circumstances and so on, which, when we say it, makes a whole lot of sense, but we don't often remember it in the quote heat of the moment. So, for instance, as we've talked about on numerous occasions, when we have the vestiges of an unusual or an aberrant time in the history of the church, whether it's in the memories of people of days when Sunday schools and churches were packed with people, or in the physical structures that we enter that remind us of a time when we needed more space. It's really important to remember why those circumstances arose and what caused those things to happen, and recognize that while there were many spiritual and religious elements involved, there were also social and economic and political circumstances involved that we can't mimic, we can't recreate. And so to attempt to recreate the results of those circumstances is futile and frustrating. It's really dangerous to try and predict the future on the basis of the past. Neither people, nor institutions, nor nations are constantly repeating the same cycle. We're not locked in. On the other hand, learning about our story can perhaps give us some signposts to where the future might unfold. It's unlikely that an individual or an organization will radically shift their behavior or their outlook unless we can find some mechanisms to make that shift. So, for instance, in the United Church, it's unlikely that literal interpretation of Scripture will become the official doctrine of the church without some huge intervention. We know that from the story. It's unlikely that United Church congregations will cease to be involved in the issues, either local or national or global, that move people to express their faith. Now, it is conceivable, I suppose, that United Church congregations might become closed communities uninvolved in their world, but that's unlikely. And so, while we don't want to try and predict the future on the basis of our study, I invite you to be thinking about, given what you know about the United Church, its strengths and its weaknesses, what are some of the uh, what are some of the trends? Where might we go? What might we build on? Because that's always the most effective way of moving into a more expansive future, is to take the things that we're doing well now and build on them. It's not very often, it does happen, but it's not very often that we make the radical shift from doing one thing to doing something entirely different without a form of intervention. And while we may believe in miracles, it's usually bad practice to develop a plan, which at this point requires this particular miracle. That's a type of control most of us don't exercise. If we, think about the church from say the last decade, or from wherever that chapter 2003, that chapter that I wrote for Schweitzer's book, left off. What are some of the trends that we might see, and where might we reach back? And I gave you two or three readings which look at some of those factors. And so where might we see the church going? Well, one of the factors that I identified in the article that I wrote is the diminishing of the participatory nature of church decision making. I trace the evolution from the early days when there was so much consultation and so much cooperation and so much interconnection of the various bodies of the church to the present day when the General Council Executive is drawn from membership at large. And I would say that one of the changes that causes the disconnect, if you like, between the congregations and the national body is when we started to, through a national nominating system, elect people to national offices who had no place in other courts of the church. And as I trace in my article, it's not necessarily a bad thing to open up the doors so that people other than church junkies get appointed and elected to important roles. But it does mean that those who have no other place to gain information are very much at the mercy of the information provided to them in their national meetings. And so, without any thought of there being any malicious intent, what we end up with is a situation where uh, because these folks don't necessarily know what's going on in the local courts of the church, the national courts of the church become disconnected. And there's good reason for that shrinking of the democratic or the participatory role because that costs money and requires people. And we haven't necessarily had many of those. So that's a trend that I think we will see continuing, that disconnect. And that, of course, I find that troubling. Another issue that I think will continue to plague us and will certainly be a factor of the ministry of most of you is the increasing degree of congregational autonomy that we will see. And that's built right into the new regional structure. And again, there may be very good reasons in terms of the resources available for doing that, but it will change the nature of the United Church. We're already seeing that in terms of the isolation of congregations and clergy. And my hunch is that the role of the region will increasingly be one of putting out fires and reading the Riot Act, which will inevitably lead to alienation from the local communities of faith. It also means that there's going to be a lot more weight put on your shoulders to make sure that you have the supports and the community and the collegiality that folk like me sort of inherited when we were part of Presbytery and Conference. It also means that you are going to have a far greater role in communicating to your congregations the what's going on in the national church, because the local lay representatives to the region don't get to hear anything except the once a year regional meetings unless they happen to be part of a regional committee. So that flow of information, which didn't always work but could be enabled to be very important, that's lost too. So these are not necessary things that can happen, but they are trends that we might project from the past into the future. And we know from our study of history that the connection between the local congregation and the national bodies of the church has in many ways been diminishing for some decades, and current changes may simply exacerbate those. John Young, in his sort of summary article, refers us back again to the evangelical liberal nature of the church. And those might seem like contrary terms if you read a lot of the media today. But for our founders and for much of our history, that was an important touchstone for our church, that indeed we did have a message that was important to convey. We had a message that was important to convey, and it was not a strictly doctrinaire message, and it was a message that was connected to the developments in science and economics and so on. So, liberal in the sense of being open to different forms of information, liberal being open to a freedom of expression and conviction within the tent of the church, but evangelical in the sense of we have a conviction about the good news of Jesus, and that messages of deliverance and redemption and healing for our world, and we don't need to suppress it. Now, of course, over time, we've been back and forth on that, and certainly we've had to, and we need to continue to think about what does it mean to be evangelical in a denomination which treasures freedom of thought and of expression, which accepts and indeed celebrates the multicultural and multi-religious nature of Canada. How do we engage in those respectful conversation? Back in the 1970s and 80s, Canadian theologian Douglas John Hall, United Church of Canada theologian Douglas John Hall, who taught at McGill, wrote a series of books about the end of Christendom. And back in those days, they were seemingly cast down the way. But he has proven to be accurate in his reading of our history into our future. The ending of Christendom, that interweaving of church and society and government and economics and so on, all gathered together under a nominally Christian notion of what the good is, that's fractured. And so you will be exercising ministry in a time and a place where, excuse me, the role of the church is very different. But you may have many congregants who remember a different way of being church in our society. And that will be one of the joys and one of the challenges of your time. The question of purpose looms large, and we've talked about throughout the story of the church the purpose for the founding of the church and how we are a purpose driven denomination, not necessarily a theologically driven denomination, but a purpose driven denomination, and the purpose being mission, whether that mission was the kingdom of God, social justice, being the soul of the nation, moral rearmament. It was all directed towards, both with individuals and communities, the creation of the kingdom on earth. How do we re-envisage that purpose today? And many of the congregations that struggle most in these days are those who really don't have a purpose. They haven't identified anything. And we saw how, and this is a lesson, we have seen how at different times along the way, our forebears made choices. They chose to concentrate on this, not because other things were wrong or bad or unimportant, but because this is where they were called. I think there's much to be said to us in some of those decision-making processes about how we might look to the future of congregations and denominations. We've seen the evolution of the church's thought about mission. You may recall in the early days how we talked about how mission was something that we took to them, whether that mission was to other parts of the globe or was to parts of the prairies or the inner city. But we often thought of mission as being someplace else, somewhere else, often done by somebody else. How will we draw from our rich history in this time when, in fact, the local congregation is the mission outpost? And the mission field starts right at our church door, if not inside the church. We can reach back to times when congregations girded themselves together to serve their communities in radical ways, particularly if we look at the Women's Auxiliary and the Women's Missionary Society and the work that they did during the Depression and at other times, the work that they did during the Second World War. If we look at the work that they did during times of crisis, then we can also perhaps find hints and suggestions of where we might go in the future. We've seen an evolution too in the role of the clergy. You may recall that we've seen an evolution in what the clergy are expected to do. And that role, I think, is going to continue to evolve so that the clergy move from doing to equipping. That continual discussion about the role of the clergy and what ministry means, that's as we've seen, always been a live conversation for the United Church. We've never really settled on one image, and that might be to our advantage going forward as we move into a time when there were maybe fewer trained and credentialed clergy supporting a larger number of lay leaders. And what does that look like? And where does that fit into our emerging and evolving ideas about ministry? We've also seen that the church, and this is another place where I think the future will continue from where we are. We've seen that the congregations of the United Church have grown in their sense of freedom to be different, to be unique, to be themselves, from a time when very much a one size fits all model. Whether that was appropriate or not, it was thought okay to have a one size fits all model of the churches, to a time now where we have congregations doing their own thing. And that seems to be working for the congregations that are prepared to find the practices and the ways of being that inspire them and empower them without feeling badly about the things that they aren't doing. And so in Diana Butler Bass's book, she talks about congregations who are rediscovering ancient practices, ancient traditions, and fostering revival of spirit and mission and community, not because other things are wrong, but by being willing to focus on things which speak to that community. And I think that's really crucial. The idea of well, we spoke of it last week, doing an assessment of the gifts and skills, and to remember that even the questions and the burning issues that congregations have can be resources to the future. It's not just what we can do that we want to do in that skills and gifts inventory, that appreciative inquiry, but it's also what moves us, what's calling us forward. What other things do you think will continue and perhaps accelerate? Clearly, we are on a trajectory of walking with First Nations, living out and walking out those apologies that were made, and clearly, as we've seen, that process is in no way over. It's not something that the nation or individuals are going to get over in a hurry, and it's perhaps appropriate that we not get over them in a hurry. It's quite appropriate, but it'll take time, and we will have to continue to exercise patience around our middle class Anglo desire to see a problem and fix it and move on. This is not a problem to be fixed, it's a condition to be lived with. And the same can be said, I hope, about our growing awareness of the impact of our structures and our basic outlook on other racial groups, both within the church and in the community. We will probably continue the trajectory of being supportive in not always effective ways to folks of emerging sexual expressions, gender identities, fluidity there. And so we will probably continue to find ourselves mired in discussion and sometimes controversy. And we've discovered that that doesn't kill us. And we've learned that, hard as those conversations might be, we might be able to not only survive them, but also thrive because of them. So, the question that I want to bring to our class on Thursday is the question of, where do you see the United Church's mission evolving in the future? What of the threads that we've identified in our journey would you like to continue and see carry on? How do you think that can happen? How do you think we can perhaps change the focus if that needs to happen? Intensify the focus, look to different ways. What can we do? What would you like to see us do? Building on what we've learned, knowing our unique gifts and skills and charisms from the Spirit. What would you like to see? Where would you like to see the United Church be going in the next few years? If you were going to be writing the next chapter, or the next couple of chapters in Don Schweitzer's book on the history of the United Church, what would you like to be able to report on? I'm looking forward to that conversation. We'll see you in class.